Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast.
Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Katie.
Katie, we're here today to talk about one thing and one thing only. What is that?
The fact that we are hot and bothered is what we're going to talk about.
That's right.
It has been brutal on the East Coast recently. And it's funny. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of a lag between when we record the podcast and when it comes out. And it looks like maybe there's going to be a little bit of a break in this heat coming up in the next couple of days. But it's been unseasonably hot after an unseasonably cold spring. And that is basically all I am seeing in Training Peaks in terms of comments and the only thing I'm thinking about in terms of feel.
Yeah, it's funny because we have, we prepare all these podcast notes and we write all this stuff out. And then Katie, you said, I just have a few things I want to talk about. And your first thing was heat. And I was like, that's the only thing I actually want to talk about. We prepared all this other stuff for the podcast. But I feel like, I just got off the Zoom with somebody who's training they're training overseas in a really hot place. And all we talked about for 45 minutes was heat. How do we identify when it's a problem? What do we do? What are our expectations? How do we train in it versus, getting ready for a race? So kind of wanted to just talk through sort of all that because I think everybody's sort of dealing with that right now, no matter where you are in the world. Like, what do I do, right? It's suddenly super, super hot out there.
Absolutely. And there's a couple things we could sort of break this down into. I think there's sort of the mental ways that we think about heat and how we sort of modify mentally, as well as just physiologically what is happening and knowing that our capabilities are going to be very different in the heat. So maybe I'll just get us started with a couple of thoughts, and then you've added some really, really good ones. We will hit our other insights if we have time, but this is going to be a very, very big focus on heat for today. So I think for me, often something that's helpful when it is super, super hot out is dropping some of the data that I'm normally using. We talk a lot about kind of what data is useful and what data isn't, but things like pace and power are not really going to be reliable indicators of your effort when it's super, super hot out. And especially when the humidity is high too, those things together. We talked about this Jim Anderson heat index, the JAHI. We've mentioned it many times on the podcast, but if you're adding together that heat and the humidity in terms of temperature and humidity, once it's over, do we say like 130, 140, things get really, really dicey. And we've basically had that like every single day. And what I'll add to that is it's tricky because sometimes you're like, okay, well, if I get up really, really early and I do it super early in the morning, maybe it will be fine. But often it's like 90% humidity early in the morning and it still might be like 70 degrees, which can feel just as bad as going out in 85 degrees in the afternoon when the humidity is a little bit lower. So there's really often like no way to escape it. So back to pace and power for me, often I will just look at any type of easy training in my week and say, okay, I am only going by heart rate today. That might mean that I'm taking walk breaks. That might mean that my run pace is like a minute slower than it otherwise would be on like a crisp, cool fall day or something like that, or one of these rainy spring days. But that helps me not get so frustrated when I see that the pace is different because the intention of the workout becomes, hey, I just want to stick in a specific heart rate zone. At the same time, sometimes you just need to drop data altogether and go by feel. Sometimes heart rate is just off the charts crazy, kind of no matter what you're doing. And in that case, if you find that the frustration about the heat is making the workout even worse, that's where we say like, okay, we're going for time. I'm going to move my body for 30 minutes today, for 45 minutes today. And I actually find that sometimes when you're seeing that runaway train effect in a workout, let's say you're supposed to run for easy hour, and by 40 minutes, you are just way into kind of tempo threshold. It's supposed to be easy. That's where I would actually recommend, let's shut it down. Let's go inside. Let's cool off. We could consider if we want to maybe like hop on the treadmill later in the day or something, or get some easy bike volume for run training, for example, and we could apply this to biking as well. But sometimes it's not worth it to just turn this into like a weird tempo threshold stimulus if that's not what the day is calling for, especially if then that's going to compromise your ability to hit other workouts in the week.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I've heard this from a number of athletes this week, saying, I'm running, Tony mentioned 1 minute slower per mile. And, this is a time of year where people have worked super hard all winter to get to this place to arrive. Like, I'm fit and I'm getting faster. And people are starting to see those, results and, maybe like April, May. And all of a sudden, this weather hits, June, you're supposed to be fast. And like, wait a minute, I'm 1 minute slower than I've been in the past. Or like my watts are down by, 10%, 20%, or simply just can't even push the watts. So there's this really mental gymnastics you have to go through. And I get it. Like, it's very disappointing. You see people just being really disappointed in training, and especially in racing when it's super hot. We've had a couple hot races already this year for most of our athletes, and there's just so much disappointment in people. And I get it because, you guys work so hard to get to a place to be fit, and you are fit, but you don't get a chance to express it. And not only you don't get a chance to express it, you don't even come close, to maybe your plan A, your plan B, even your plan C for races.
Absolutely. And I think when we think about races in particular, I had a few athletes race over the weekend at the Patriot Half Ironman, for example. Patriot Half is notoriously known for it can be a really, really intense hot day, or it can be totally cool and nice. I've done that race twice. The first time I ever did it was a perfect 65 degree, zero wind, cloudy day. And I had one of the best races of my life. And then I think 4 years later, I came back and it was 85 degrees and super humid, and I had a terrible day. And I know my fitness was better 4 years later, but it was not reflected because of those conditions. So I was talking a little bit to the athletes who did that. And I think anyone who has a race coming up and you know that it's going to be hot, something to remind yourself is a race is just an expression of fitness on that day in those conditions. Mm-hmm. It's not like an objective indicator of on the perfect day what you could do. It's what conditions were we dealt. That might mean it was really hot conditions. That might mean it was really rainy and cold conditions. That might mean you were a little sick going in, or you had a baby and the baby was up all night. All these different things. It's just a snapshot of those conditions. And so maybe taking the pressure off every single race has to be this end all be all, my best fitness looks like this. Of course, we want that if we want to be in alignment with maybe what our A goal was. But keep in mind that you probably set your A goal in November or January or sometime where we didn't even have to think about this heat variable. And it seems like every single year we sort of reset and forget that it is so, so brutal out there. So just know that you're not alone if you're feeling that. But sometimes I think it does require a little bit of preemptive mindset shifting around either the workout goals or the race goals. Just knowing that physiologically, it's really, really, really hard to perform at the same level in those conditions than you would on the perfect conditions day.
Yeah, I think what's really hard is, we have all this data, we have all this quantification, I have my FTP and my run threshold, and we have all this, this is my swim, threshold pace. But the reality is that one of the biggest factors, and the biggest factor on race day really is not your fitness. It is this extreme heat and humidity, or maybe it's raining or it's super windy. And there's no way to quantify that, which you could just push it into a computer and say, oh, look, I've got this kind of fitness. These are my thresholds. This is my FTP. But the heat will be this, the humidity will be that, the wind will be this way and this and that way. And I think, I don't know what the percentage, and Katie, I'm kind of interested to hear what you think, but this could be a 50% variable, right? I mean, it's not just it's hot and humid today, I have to take off, 5% of my performance. It's no, I may have to take off 25% of my, it's a really big number. Again, I don't know what that number is, but it's massive. And there's no way for us to know in advance what the effect's going to be. And I think that's super frustrating. And in this day and age when everything can seem to be computed, this still can't be computed.
Totally. And I think there is sort of this really tricky part of June in particular, or even really hot days in May, where we just don't really have any acclimation going in. And I think we could talk about okay, if you wanted to optimize for the heat, what is the perfect heat training protocol where you're sort of mixing that in and you're getting in the sauna and all this stuff. But I think most of our listener base, and I think even you and I, we are time crunched athletes. And it's really hard to say okay, well, where is my 30 minutes every single day to get in the sauna on top of all the training that I'm doing, all the life that I'm doing? I spent all of last episode talking about how it's really hard to even have time to recover, let alone get in the sauna every single day. So, if we were really angling for end all be all, I have a professional athlete lifestyle and this is what I'm going to do. Yes, there are controllables, but I think instead we have to think about what's realistic and how we want to spend our time. And unfortunately, sometimes that means, maybe unfortunately or fortunately, it's a mindset thing, and it's a little bit about shifting some of those mindset variables. But I think we can also talk a little bit just about practical strategies for how we should approach our week, given that heat is not really going anywhere. Yes, we might get a little bit more acclimated as we're sort of moving through these weeks, but what to look out for and how to think about kind of your repeatable basic week in the heat, which does change the variables quite a little bit. So let's first talk about intervals. So everyone usually has some interval workouts in their week, whether you're on the bike or on the run. Do we think it's even valuable to do those intervals if it is extremely hot or humid out? Or what might we do to maybe change around our week plan if we know that it's just going to be really, really bad pretty much every day that we try to go out and do this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I've been talking to a lot of people about. Is my general advice is that look ahead in your week and look at your key sessions. Okay, what are my key sessions? And for a lot of people right now, especially for long distance athletes, it's the bigger, say for example, like it's the bigger ride, right? It's the volume ride of the weekend. And what, people have been asking like, well, what should I do? Should I do that in the dead heat of the day or should I do that? And my advice sort of is to start with is get up early if you can and get some of that, at least get 50% of that ride done before the heat gets really, really, really hot, before, things get, kind of dangerous out there. So that's just my general advice is like try to get some of it in. Don't take the whole thing in. And maybe as the summer progresses, you're more heat acclimated and you can spend more time on the bike, for example, or maybe your longer run out in the heat. But for now, I'd say start with something as early as possible, get some of it out of the way before you go. And then just in general, again, in terms of like if it's a weekday and it's intervals, sweet spot intervals, for example, on the bike or a run, tempo on the run, I would try to do all those in the cool of day if possible or inside. I mean, I don't recommend right now anybody going out and there is no, got to get hard. You got to stay tough. We're trying to be consistent as possible. And I think the hard thing about the heat is it kind of sneaks up on you. You don't really know you're getting, maybe heat stroke or even just some sort of bad effects of heat. You don't really feel it, it sort of comes on. So, for us, I know we're very conservative and we always want to think about like, what does this mean for tomorrow? What does this mean for next week? What does this really mean in terms of my whole entire season?
Absolutely. And I think we could talk about run training too. I feel like you're very plugged into bike training right now. I'm pretty plugged into run training. You want to think about what the intention of any given interval workout is. And if doing it in the heat is actually going to give you like a different stimulus or not the one that you're looking for, then it's probably not the right fit. So if, for example, let's say you have a track workout, like I could think of a track workout I did recently. Maybe it was like 12 by 1 at a 5K pace and then a mile at sort of a threshold pace. It's a pretty common type of workout for us, kind of some fast stuff and then a little bit more of a sustained effort. And if I were to go out and know that even in the warm up, because it's hot, I'm going to be at kind of tempo threshold heart rate. And then I'm going to try to do my 1-1s, but instead my heart rate is just crazy high the whole time. It's not even varying when I try to recover. And then I go out and try to run another mile fast, but already it's a runaway train. This is turned into basically like an hour thresholdy workout without any variation in the heart rate. And probably I'm already going to be so cooked by the time I get to that fast mile that it's not going to be very fast. It's going to be kind of like a moderate pacey type thing. So I'm not necessarily getting like that fast twitch stimulus that I wanted to. Instead, I'm just completely overheated. And so that would be an example where I'd say, okay, look at your whole week. Is there a time and day and weather window in which you could do this and it could be a little bit cooler? If not, maybe do I consider doing this on the treadmill or some variation on the treadmill? And if the answer is no to both of those questions, I would sub that for an easy run with strides or something like there's some power hills, something like that at the end.
Mm-hmm.
We have to, it's really tricky. I mean, even right now when I'm trying to think about all the variables that I'm trying to keep together of like, this is when I can work out, this is when I can't work out, and the baby needs me at this time, that's really hard to do. But just knowing that it's always an option to modify to easy with strides, that's probably going to get you a little bit closer to what the intention of that day was, which is, an easy stimulus except for the hard work. And here the hard work might just turn into like 6 by 30 seconds because that's all that we can handle in this level of heat.
Yeah, and I'd almost go so far as to say, if you are just, super time crunch and the only time you can do something is, in the heat, it's super extreme heat. We've had some of those days. I'd say I would vote for skipping a workout even just if it's super, super, super hot. I think, Katie, this week, down in Boston, for example, like you guys had just extreme heat and humidity. I was just on there briefly for 24 hours. And I was like, I don't know how people even walk around outside. It's so insane. I'd rather have you skip your workout than just do anything at all in this kind of conditions.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about heat stroke. I think probably you and I have both had sort of like dances with close to heat stroke or even getting all the way there. What should we be looking for if we're concerned about this? Because we did talk about the fact that it is kind of sneaky. Like it's something that can just sort of sneak up on you and you're like, you're not feeling good, but then off the cliff. So what are you looking for just in terms of personal indicators so that we can just keep tabs on like, is everything okay with how I'm handling the heat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, especially on the bike, for example, like I'll start to see like sweat sort of pooling on my arms and my legs. If I look down and I see first of all, it's my forearm really shiny, and can I see sort of individual droplets of sweat that's just sort of pooling there. And what's happening in that case is that how we cool ourselves is that moisture comes to the skin and then it evaporates and it takes away that heat. So what's happening now is that it's not taking away any heat. So this is the massive red flag. And if you see this on your arms and your legs, it just really should lead you to start to begin to manage your effort with extreme care. So big red flag, that's the big one here. And the hard part is that because, say, for example, you're on a bike and maybe you're going, I don't know, 15 miles an hour or something, 20 miles an hour, you don't feel hot because there is some sort of convective cooling that's going on, right? So you're like, oh, it's fine. So in that case, sometimes like this happened to me last week as I was just doing a 40-minute tempo on an area and I started to look down and sweat was running off my face and it was, hitting my top tube. I'm like, oh, I'm working hard, and then all of a sudden I realized like, no, this is kind of a steady stream. I look down at my forearms, look down at my thighs. I'm like, oh, wow, it's pooling. Okay, great. This is, big red flag. And I started, so my first thing was like, oh, I'll just come down 10% on my watts. I'm doing a range anyway. That's fine. I'll go to the lower end. And within 5 minutes, I was like, nope, that's stupid. And I was watching my heart rate go up. And then I started saying, well, maybe I'll take 15% off my thing. And it really was like, I went down to zone 1 and I started looking at my heart rate and saying, okay, at this point, I just need to get home. Like, I'm halfway through my ride. I just need to get home. I'm going to watch my heart rate. I'm going to stay in zone 1 heart rate. And I actually stopped once too, just to see, like, just to check in with myself. And when I stopped, my arms were super hot. My head was hot. And again, I couldn't feel that on the bike. So stopping is really important as well. To sort of take a little assessment. And I was like, okay. And I almost called in, I almost phoned a friend there to say, come get me. I was halfway through this 3-hour ride. And I was like, should I even stop and not go on? I thought, well, let me just go a little bit further. From here, it's a little bit downhill for a few miles. But again, it's going to watching my heart rate, just going to stay in zone 1. And again, I'm thinking about, how's it going to make me feel later? But most importantly, like, how is this going to affect the rest of my week and potentially the rest of my season?
Yeah, this is really helpful and sort of like an illustrative way to think about how do I manage a situation once I realize that I'm sort of in that heat danger zone. I think the steps are, first, you can try for a finite amount of time to just take the watts or take the pace down a little bit, like take it sort of away from that tempo zone that maybe you were trying for, go into more of like a steady zone 2 thing. If you're not seeing any change in heart rate when you do that and or you see that sweat is still pooling, that's where the next step is like, okay, we need to take this to zone 1. And honestly, for runners, that might be like, we need to start walking and that's okay. Or we need to start like run walk intervals. Even something like, I'm going to jog for a minute, I'm going to walk for a minute. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about how that can be a really effective strategy in triathlon racing. So it's okay to try it in any given run, for example. And if that's not working, you go to zone 1. I think that is where you make a plan to phone a friend. Like you just say, you know what? Or you're like running and you're like, I'm going to hop on the T and I am going home that way, or I'm going to call an Uber or whatever it is. It's just not worth it, so that you can preserve sort of the next day. Because keep in mind that if you kind of keep pushing and not listening to those signals, that could potentially compromise like the rest of your week, or at least the next couple of days of workouts, or even longer than that if you get into a really kind of rough health situation. So this is something to probably not necessarily play around with. But I like the idea that there is like a roll down. It's not just like, oh, it's a hot day, I'm stopping. It's like, let's try all of these steps and then see kind of what is resonating and what feedback my body is giving me of whether this is sustainable or just not the day to do it.
Yeah, and there are band-aids too. Like the call I had right before this recording, Katie, was an athlete who's, saying she's a new athlete and she's starting to do longer rides. And she said, well, is there anything I can do, once I get to that place besides going to zone 1? And I'm like, okay, yeah, there's a couple things. Like, yeah, you can stop. Like again, first stop, just checking out, just be mindful, just run a heat check on your body. But number 2, you can pour water over your arms and your legs and over your head. And that's a sort of a Band-Aid. You might get like, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. If you're feeling good, you're sending a signal to your brain saying, hey, it's safe. That's good. Katie, you and I have jumped in many rivers before during. And again, that can also get you maybe, a full body immersion in a cold stream can get you maybe another 20 minutes, depending on what the conditions are. Maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 30 minutes, gets you further down the road. And again, it's a practical in the sense of, yes, you are cooling yourself and you are telling your brain like, yeah, it's safe. I'm managing the situation. Don't worry. But there's really nothing, there's nothing you can really do out there practically that's going to, go from like, if you're in the heat danger zone, like there's nothing you can do that gets you out of that heat danger zone besides stopping and going inside.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that reminds me actually of, I think, a race sim that I did sometime before Ironman Lake Placid of 2023, where we were riding up the Kancamagus Highway in New Hampshire. And it was one of those brutal, intense days, but that was the day that worked out for everyone's schedules. And it was literally like, there is an alpine stream coming down next to the road, and we are going to get over into the stream, fully clothed, get completely submerged, get back on the bike. And even so, like, yeah, that probably bought us like 10 minutes of feeling okay. Sometimes that's the thing that you do. And again, again, like if it's a long day, Ironman day, and there's no cell service like on the Kank, then maybe, yeah, that's what you need to do. You need to be creative with that. And at the same time, like you're not going to jump in the Charles River if you're in Boston. Obviously, there are things that work and things that don't here. But just having a lot of tools in your toolkit of like, this is what I can try, and knowing that, making the smart choice that's in alignment with health is never necessarily a bad thing. That's probably the mindset to bring to some of these. And then I think something else we should just be planning for is really, really good hydration can help you a little bit. So think about pre-workout and post-workout, like slamming those electrolytes, especially if you're starting to get like nauseous or headachy. Sometimes that can be not only a heat thing, but also an electrolyte imbalance. So just making sure that you're getting in enough salt in the electrolytes that you're taking in. I find that like in the winter, if I pop like a noon tablet in my water, it doesn't really matter. It's not that big of a deal. But right now it's like element all day, like really high sodium, high salt, because just living your life, walking around, you're probably already losing a lot of sweat and electrolytes. And so therefore it's so, so important to make that a huge priority, both in your day and the day before and the day after and during for handling the heat.
Yeah, it's funny. This Sally was saying, "Hey, how much should I do of this? How much should that?" And we're sort of getting down the rabbit hole of like details of hydration and nutrition. And I was like, I just stopped for a moment. I said, "Okay, hold on, time out. Here's the general principle. You are an endurance athlete, have a lot of demands on your time and your body, your mental energy." I said, every athlete that I know right now is probably a little bit underfueled and definitely underhydrated. So let's just start with that's the place where we're pretty much all at right now. So it's like with the hydration, like, yeah, definitely before and after. And, what I'm adjusting to now is that, yeah, a normal ride that was 2 water bottles a month ago is now almost can be up to 4 water bottles, right? Okay, so where would I stop? Do I bring an extra water bottle? Like sort of thinking through those logistics of like, how do I get that extra stuff in? So, when in doubt, have another snack and drink another water bottle and bring another water bottle.
And keep in mind, too, a quick note on nutrition there is often it's a lot harder to digest food or digest really anything if it's really, really hot. Like your appetite can go away. You can feel like you don't really want to take in stuff. That's sometimes what gets people who are otherwise pretty good at fueling is like, I cannot even imagine the idea of putting like a bar into my hot mouth right now and trying to deal with that. So just know that you should probably be practicing lots of different hydration and nutrition sources. Some people have the effect of like they're taking carb mix, but they're just so thirsty and they also need a bottle of something that's just like plain electrolytes or something like that. But I would use these hot days as an opportunity to test different things out and just know that, even if you have your nutrition and hydration strategy dialed on that perfect, crisp 60-degree day, it might not necessarily feel that way on the race day that you're likely to get. And with this, I want to jump further ahead in our outline. Jim, you have a really helpful electrolyte product guide here. I think maybe let's just talk through how you've approached hydration because you've been smashing some really big bike mileage recently and I think have like been outside in a lot of this. So how are you approaching your hydration and what types of products are you using?
Yeah, just doing exactly what we just said, which was trying to get in something, before I go out on the bike. So for everyday use, I'm really enjoying, the precision hydration tabs, either the 500 or the 1000. And we put a link here. I put a link here to all the products we're mentioning here. And Katie, you mentioned Element, which I did not use much through the wintertime because I didn't really feel like I needed 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour, but that's what we recommend in this hot stuff. And, I've now gone to back to Element. Element has become like my main source of, so it's funny. It sat in the shelf literally for 7 months. And then as soon as it got hot, I was like, oh, I have a bunch of Element and this is the perfect tool for the job. So I'm aiming for that 1,000 milligrams of sodium per bottle per hour, or even more, honestly. But I'd say, for anybody, I'd recommend just in general, like start with 800 to 1,000 and Element makes it easy to that. So, and they have lots of different flavors because I know that becomes a thing over, long rides. But I'm getting flavor fatigue. And then Element has got all kinds of different flavors you can have as well. And then there's other products I've mentioned on here that, like, for example, like Scratch has an electrolyte mix, which is unflavored. You can just add that to any water bottle with your carbs in it. So that may appeal to somebody who's unflavored. And then I also recommend having just around, like having some salt pills. That's really helpful for on the run. And I've put a link for pH sodium pills, which I've used. Also salt stick electrolyte capsules. That's the OG of electrolytes. But some salt tabs in like a little Ziploc bag, I find is super helpful on the run. But Katie, what are you doing? How are you approaching? What products are you using right now?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty close to you. I think for everyday hydration, I do like noon tablets. I don't need a ton if it's not necessarily around. And I'm also not doing the same bike volume as you. So most of my training right now is centered around like strength and then run training. But daily hydration, I'm very rarely drinking plain water. Like usually it's some type of noon thing. And then for all of my workouts, there's element in there. And sometimes what I'll do is I like often because it's easy to get, like I'll take Gatorade or something like that. And then I'll put in the unflavored element to add to it because it
Mm.
doesn't have a ton of sodium, but it's like I wanted a little bit of that carb mix, something like that. We had some around the house. So you can always sort of mix and match. And I'll say too, when I was racing a lot of Ironman, what I would do is add element to scratch super fuel. You could just get like a lemon limey flavor for both. It was still pretty light. And then I was upping the sodium content for those really, really hot days. So it doesn't necessarily need to even be just one product. Don't be afraid to mix and match a little bit just so you can get up to that like 800 to 1,000, especially for these like long sustained, I mean, long Ironman runs, long Ironman bikes, even super long runs in general. All of that is a good opportunity to make sure that you're getting enough. And when in doubt, just like you said, salt pills or salt stick plus plain water, that works too. So if you're just like, I do not want anything flavored, I don't want it to be sticky, I don't like how that tastes or feels, then just think about that plain water with different types of salt tabs. As long as you're doing the calculation of making sure that it's the right amount of sodium, I don't really care what it looks like. It doesn't need to have a flavor. It's just all about kind of hitting that sodium content and then that carb content. And that carb content, again, can also come from anything. As long as you're targeting like that 70 to 90 grams to start, you're in a good place. It can come from truly any source. And I would say use sort of these remaining long workouts for people who have Ironmans kind of later in the summer. Use these remaining long workouts as an opportunity to test that every single time so that it's automatic and you don't have to think about it on race day.
Yeah, yeah. My go-to, just for folks is on the bike, is I do Morton in my bottles, and then I just pour an element on top of that. It's just sort of a sidebar for when Morton first came out with their hydrogel system. They said, "Oh, you can't add. There's not much sodium. We don't put much sodium in our mixture because it's going to mess with the hydrogel stuff. And if you add sodium to it, it's going to mess it up." I just started putting Elemented right away to Morton. I've never had a problem. Morton works great for me. So, and they went back and started adding sodium to their actual mix itself. It's not 1,000, maybe it's like 200 or something. But if you do hear that, I would say just ignore it all. Add the sodium into Morton, you'll be just fine.
I love it. Well, I feel like that was hopefully a helpful deep dive on just thinking about the heat. I think this segues into some general thoughts on racing. You had some really, really great notes. And it is, as we've said, peak race season. Heat racing is one of those variables, but there's a lot of uncontrollable variables that are coming up as we talk to different athletes who are going through their race season. So maybe we hit your first insight, Jim, on how we can just prepare better for racing, especially when there are many things that we can't necessarily control or predict. We can do a lot to control things and have a plan, but we've definitely had experiences with athletes recently coming through with like, wow, I hadn't really thought of that happening in a race, and how do we get ready for it?
Yeah. So we have two parts to this, which is one is, better preparing for racing. And then we also have a little guide we'll go through about how do I find my race pace. But I guess sort of the first part here, and this came up with actually with the number of our athletes who did a local triathlon around here called Harvest Triathlon. It turns out that Harvest Triathlon swims in a pond, and that pond this year had a ton of weeds in it. So I don't know if you had people racing there or not, but I had a lot of comments about, oh my gosh, look at these weeds. This was insane. I had weeds in my legs. I had weeds in my arm. I got out of the water. I was trying to get my wetsuit off, but I had weeds all over my hand. And I was like, okay, this was mentioned by everybody. And what's interesting is that, we're going to talk about, how to better prepare for racing. But there are things like this. We call it X factor, which is you really kind of can't train for. Like you can't train for, we don't want you guys go out there and throw yourselves into a weed bed and start swimming in it. So there are going to be some things that, we just can't prepare for. And that was a big surprise for a lot of people. Although I had one triathlete who said, this is one of her first triathlons. She said, well, I thought pond weeds were just normal. I thought that was part of triathlons. So she was like, I kind of got bothered by them, but I just thought this was just part of the process. So anyway, that was kind of nice.
This is the weed obstacle.
This is the weed obstacle. Exactly right. Yeah. But it's interesting because it's also at this same race, this bike course didn't have a lot of elevation gain to it, but it's funny. Every one of my athletes who raced it said, wow, the hills were kind of killer. And I went back and looked at the profile. I was like, there's not really any hills here, but it's just interesting because it's just a different course than most people are used to, like either on the trainer or just sort of where they've been training. So it was a little bit different than the sort of up and down as opposed to a real flat. So again, people just weren't quite prepared for that. And that's something we can prepare for, so well, it's a physical thing, but it's also a mental thing. You get out there and you go, wow, like this course is so hard. This course is so hard. And I've had this narrative many times, like I'm struggling so hard here. And part of it is that, I came out of the swim and my heart rate was, probably 175 and I'm trying to blast the bike. And, and if you think about it, even on a sprint course, if you start the bike, full throttle and you're already almost at max heart rate, like any hill is going to kind of feel like a mountain. So I kind of get that. But anyway, the fact is that racing often provides this chances for unfamiliar stimuluses. And when you sort of face that unfamiliar stimulus, your brain's like, well, what's going on? Like it can't predict, or it's trying to run predictive models. And I think that's where you sort of begin to, I start to struggle and I start to create this mental narrative in my head. But the reality is that a lot of times, like everybody around you is sort of suffering from the same thing too. But you only seem to find out that out later after the race. You're talking to people, you're like, was that course really hard? And people are like, oh my God, that course was so hard. And even though maybe it wasn't hard on paper, it just kind of was, because again, most people weren't, familiar with that stimulus. So that's a really common and it's an easy mental trap to fall in. So I know for myself, when I start to feel that way, I start to, okay, hold on, let me just come out of this here. Everybody's kind of experiencing the same thing. So what is it? What can we do? What are some practical strategies we can do about this? And again, the answer isn't, we can't replicate every possible race scenario. Again, we're not going to throw you out there in the weeds, but you can consistently put yourself in new situations where you encounter the unfamiliar, right? And so you want to get comfortable with sort of being uncomfortable. You want to get comfortable with like, yeah, wow, this is a new course, or this is a new group of people. Or for example, like I'm swimming in a different pond or lake. I know that really, I have one place I'd love to swim, but sometimes I go to a different lake and I'm always like, oh wow, this is just different. Like maybe it's not super uncomfortable, but it's like different landmarks, and like the water feels different, it tastes different. Maybe I can see the bottom, maybe I can't see the bottom, but like there's lots of different stimuluses. This can happen with like biking a new loop or riding or running with a group, right? So there's all these different things that you can do to sort of say, yeah, I've got my normal thing that I do, my normal run loop, my trainer, whatever it is, I've set up a really nice situation. But we talk about this a lot. It's like sort of training your nervous system to put yourself in just create a little bit of chaos, create something a little bit unfamiliar. So when it comes to race day, you're always going to face, multiple things during a race. Even if you've raced the same race, last year, you're going to find something this year that's different than last year. So just this ability to kind of roll with it and get comfortable and take in these new stimuluses and then be able to process that and put it in context and then just roll from there.
I love this. And I think something that's helpful to add to this is just labeling, like, you know what, the intention of today is I'm throwing in a little chaos. I'm putting myself in an unfamiliar situation and I want to see how I react to it, rather than saying like the intention of today is to nail the perfect power, the perfect pace. I'm going to hit everything perfectly on paper. It's like, no, actually, maybe those things are not going to be perfect. Maybe you're doing a little bit of energy into navigating and therefore you miss the interval that you were trying to do. Like that's okay, because these are really actionable race skills. And I think it's interesting. This reminds me, I think it was last week or maybe 2 weeks ago when it was really hot. I had a run workout on the calendar. It was sort of borderline. It was probably like 75 degrees and 70% humidity, which is like, could probably be okay, but it is going to be hot. It's not going to feel amazing. And I was sort of like, I don't know if there's another day this week that I could do this. And I go out for the run and my heart rate's already a little up and I stopped and I drafted a text to my run coach and I was like, hey, I'm not feeling awesome. Like, should I just pivot this to easy? And then before I sent it, I just took a deep breath and I was like, okay, but what if on my race day, it's exactly like this? Odds are it probably will be. So what if I just approach today as seeing how my body responds doing something kind of hard in conditions that seem a little bit unfavorable? And it was actually awesome because then I didn't send the text. I just started my run. Yeah, it was hard, but I got to use all these mental tactics of like, okay, if it's feeling like this is how I might dial the pace down. And knowing that in that day, for example, just taking the goal paces down by about 5 to 10% did work. I did not end up in a heat stroke situation. It turned out that all I needed to do was just take the gas off a little bit rather than have this like all or nothing day. And it was mostly just about shifting my mindset around the workout. Like today is just to see how I do in these conditions. Because realistically, if I've got a road race coming up in late June, it's probably not going to be 50 degrees and cloudy and awesome. Like odds are it's probably going to be jockey of over 140. So if I even want to show up at all, I need to get some practice of doing that. And this, like all these different things that you talked about are ways to practice that of like, I'm going with the group. I don't really know how it's going to go, but I'm going to practice being in a group setting happening where things are uncertain and seeing how I respond, because I'm always in control of how I respond. I'm not necessarily in control of all these unfamiliar things that are happening.
Yeah, I love this. And I love that, Katie, I have the same reaction. Like I know my personality. My personality is sort of catastrophize the thing. Like, oh my God, oh, it's so hot or whatever. Something is happening. And that's typically my first response to almost everything in life. And when I'm trying to learn life, is like, okay, like exactly what you just did, which was like, I'm going to take a beat. I'm going to take a couple breaths here. And I'm just going to, what's my second reaction? And I think the second reaction often tends to be a little bit more measured and a little bit more logical. And like you say, it's like, hey, now there's an opportunity, right? This is not just, it's all lost, there's no hope. And it's like, okay, hold on. There's a number of opportunities here that I've been given in this situation. And I love how you just took advantage of that and said, okay, here are the couple things I can work on because this is going to be kind of like race day. And I just love that. But anyways, this is a lesson for me, like just like literally stopping and taking a couple deep breaths and going, all right, what's my second response?
Totally. And just reminding yourself that if you only know how to perform when all of the uncontrollables just happen to be perfect, like that's a pretty precarious way to approach racing and life in general, because probably the uncontrollables will not actually be perfect. Probably there will be various things that happen either during race week or during race morning or during race day. And if you've already been in lots of situations where things weren't perfect, you're like, that's fine. I just react and I figure it out. So any way that you can practice that during your build, I think is a really, really great idea. So bonus challenge of the week, this is not our challenge, but think about ways to get comfortable being uncomfortable and then figuring out how you react and respond to that.
And this leads us into, okay, so say everything is not quite perfect, but anyway, you're starting to feel like, hey, what is my race pace? Given that, maybe it's going to be somewhat of a normal day and I've done some chaos. I am factoring in that it's going to be, X heat, X humidity. So how do I find my race pace? I get this, Katie, you probably get this question all the time for people. And unfortunately, there's so many factors that play on race day, as we've been talking about, that the answer is usually very complicated. It's not a straight line. There are many things. And I know a lot of athletes don't want to hear that. Like, they're like, well, this and this and this and this. And they're like, yeah, but coach, just tell me how fast am I going to run? I'm like, well, I can't really tell you that, but here's some things we can consider. Anyway, so we have a lot of practice. We have a lot of fitness. We have a lot of data. So I want to go through and give you some sort of guidelines. And I sort of wrote these out quickly. I'm not going to say they're scientific. Don't put them into a research journal. But this is some of the ways that I find very useful for some of our athletes. The first one is in the swim. And I think the pool really becomes your friend here. We all know that open water swimming is very, very different than pool swimming. But what I have people do is swim 5x100s at your best effort and just trying to average them within a narrow range, like within a couple seconds of each other, and do this on a 10-second rest. And then at the end of that, like sort of note the average time for this, this thing. So for example, you swam 5x100s at your best effort and your pace was 145 on average, for example, for all five of these things. So then the next I want you to swim another 5x100 on 10 seconds rest, but I want you to add about 5 seconds to the average of your first set. So for example, if you swam most of those at 145, I want you to swim the next set at around around 150 or so, right? And then sort of note the average for the second set. And what I find is that if you take the average of the second 5x100s and add about 10 seconds per 100. If you swim 3 times or more per week, if you're a really good swimmer or you're really high fitness, like add that, and that gets you around, like, so for example, like in this situation, you're now swimming at a 150, add 10 seconds, now you're at 2 minutes per 100. Pretty much that can be, a guide for how fast you're going to go in your race. If you were swimming less than 3 times per week, or you're just not that confident in the swim, I'd say you could add up to 20 seconds per 100. So maybe now it's like a 210, for example, if my math is correct. And so that gets you in the ballpark. I think one of the things that always surprises people is that, of course, it's open water, so it's easier if you have a wetsuit on, but yet there's no walls. And also, a lot of times, the times are reported in meters and not yards. Most of us are swimming in the U.S. are swimming in yards, but the timing isn't done in meters. And meters is a little bit longer. If you go swim in a 25-meter pool and you're used to yards, you'll find it takes about 2 extra strokes for me anyway to get to the end of that. So it's a little bit of a surprise. So it's a little bit longer. But that kind of gets you in the ballpark for your swim stuff. You are going to be much slower. I think the bigger lesson here is don't take your swim threshold. Oh, I did 10x100s on 10 seconds rest, and I was able to nail 135 pace. That is not going to be your pace on the water. There are so many other factors, and you kind of use this to sort of hone in on what's an expectation for the swim. But Katie, what system are you using to help people with their swim times?
This is awesome. I haven't ever kind of drilled into like approximating the math, we'll work out of how it might work. But something that I see every single time is we usually know roughly what our swim threshold paces are, and your open water swim is going to be so much slower. And I think it's helpful for people to just be prepared for that, so you don't end up judging it on race day, right? Like I think there's this common thing where you think in your head, like, okay, I haven't done a lot of open water swim practice, but I know that my threshold swim pace, like you said, maybe it's a 135 or something. And you get out of the water and you averaged like 155 per 100 yards. And already you've written a narrative about the race that was like, oh my gosh, I had a bad swim. That didn't go well. But if you instead go in and be like, yeah, it's not unrealistic to think that my open water swim pace for, say, my Olympic distance triathlon or my half Ironman is going to be like 20 to 25 seconds off what my actual threshold best day in the pool pace is, then I think you're just a little bit more prepared for what that time is going to look like. I don't even think it's that useful to look at your swim time on your watch. I mean, sometimes you can't really avoid it after you finish just because GPS is terrible in the water. Like there's lots of different factors at play here, but I love this particular practice. And if you want to do kind of a pre-race workout like that, you can talk to your coach about it and just say like, hey, I want to have a ballpark idea of what to go for. I do think what's interesting about the swim though is it's a little bit challenging. Like let's say you're on the bike, for example, you can sort of toggle your power up and down, or you can like you're running and you have some control. In the swim, we don't actually have like a great amount of control over like, okay, I think it's better for me to go 155 versus 150, like something like that, just because you can't really stare at the data. And so with that in mind, like I would use this as a way to just sort of build some expectations around what's going to happen in the water, and then go in and use our general advice for open water swimming, which is like not harder than a 5 or 6 out of 10. The swim is the warm-up act to the warm-up act, and mostly you're just trying to not stress yourself out to the point that you have a bad bike and run when you're doing the swim.
Yeah, absolutely. I start to signal this out really early, especially to my Ironman athletes. I just say to people, almost all of our athletes are going to swim somewhere between like 110 and 120. And yeah, we have some faster athletes who are going to swim faster than that. And we have some athletes who are going to swim slower than that. But in the general bell curve of things, think about 110 to 120. And I always tell people like, I don't really care if it's 120. Like it just doesn't matter. And in fact, that may benefit you because if you swam again you said like, just at a 5 or 6, right? Minimal effort. Like that's great. Like so you say it's a warm-up act to the warm-up act. So I'll just, and sometimes for half Ironman people, I'll say, 35 to 42, right? Like there it is. There's the range that most of us are swimming. Maybe there was a current, maybe you got behind somebody, you got one a little faster. Maybe it was super choppy. You were capable of swimming at 35, but you swim at 40 because it was just crazy out there. Like you just never know, right? So I like to sort of start to seed this early on with people and saying, let's not stress about the swim. Let's get enough swim fitness in. Let's get really good at being open water sighted. I want people. I think probably our biggest focus is one, easy, and number two is we want you to have superior navigation skills, like good open water sighting skills, because that just makes a huge difference. And talk about like reducing the chaos. Like if you can swim a straight line from here to there, like it reduces effort, and the whole world sort of opens up when you can see where the buoys are and where other people are, avoid danger, that kind of thing. So just really, I think we're very much a skills-based swimming outfit as opposed to like, this is the time, we got to do this, you got to be this time. Like, no, we can't do that. For the bike, target effort by race distance. We've talked about this before, but we're going to review it again. Sprint, you can probably go about 90% of your FTP, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but that's sort of an 8 or 9 out of a 10 RPE. I'd say with most of our athletes with sprint, like just, kind of go for it. Get after it, right? It's kind of a short thing. And if you've been practicing enough and you've been training with us, like you can just kind of go for it. Olympic distance, again, if you have a power meter, probably somewhere between 85 and 90% of your FTP. Half Ironman, anywhere again between 75 and 85%. And Ironman, 65% to 75%. And again, like those are big ranges here, but again, it depends on the heat, humidity. I've seen some really fast bike splits. We always, we train at 85% for our half Ironman intervals on the trainer, but I've seen some really fast half Ironman bike splits at 78% of their FTP. Why? Because they have a good bike, they have really good aero, they stay in aero, they reduce frontal drag, maybe they got a little bit of a tailwind, and they just crushed it. So the good news in all of this is that with the swim, we're often a lot slower than we think, but on the bike, I often see people are a lot faster. It's not uncommon to see people go, 1 to 3 miles an hour per hour faster on race day. Sometimes even more. So I like to say, you can look at I started looking at average times for people's training stuff and trying to equate that to race day, and I really couldn't find any kind of correlation. But in general, I don't know, Katie, do you find that just people are just sort of biking much faster on race day?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's no drafting allowed, but I still think there's something about like people around you and also not worrying about things like traffic and whatever. Like often there is just this like going faster pace variable. And that's why I just tell people, I mean, there's lots of different data points that are useful versus not useful. I don't think speed is super, super useful just because your training speed is going to be very, very different from your racing speed. Very rarely are people always training exactly on the course, and then the wind can be different and the heat can be different. So with that in mind, like heart rate and power are really, really helpful here. And then even heart rate can be a little bit fickle on race day as well as power in various ways. So using all the inputs can be helpful. On the other hand, we talk a little bit about just keeping an eye to speed because then you know like, oh, wow, I'm kind of moving along. I've got a good tailwind, or I'm factoring in like how long do I think my overall bike is going to take if I have a specific time goal, all of that. But just know that like it is cool and awesome that we will probably ride a little bit faster speed wise on race day. That's just something to be prepared for. And with that in mind, you still can't even necessarily compare like race to race speed versus year to year speed. There's just lots of different variables that impact that.
Yep, exactly. And then, of course, we hit the run and we're back to probably running a little bit slower than what we think we might run. But I think that in that sense, we get a better sense. We can often nail, I think, race pace a little bit better. I think one, because we have a lot of race simulations. And so coming out of all this, like, hopefully, like most people ask me all the time, like, how fast should I run off the bike? I'm like, well, what did you do in the race sim? And like, for example, if you ran 5 miles off your half Ironman race sim and it felt good, do you think you could sustain that for 13 miles? So I always come back to people asking people, like, I'm not going to give you the answer. I'm going to ask the question, during your bricks, during your race sims, during your, your key sessions, you ran, say, for example, 8:30 pace, for 5 miles off that 4x20 half Ironman intervals. That's a beefy workout, right? Could you sustain that for 13 miles? And then most people always come back, well, yes or no, or yes for this point, but if I took 10 seconds off, I definitely could run that for 13 kind of thing. Again, all things being equal, being fuel, that kind of stuff in extreme heat. But I think a lot of people they're really good. Like I think all the times people are asking me to give them a number, and just going back and forth a couple times with folks, like we pretty quickly arrive at a very reasonable, and often they're kind of just almost bang on. Again, in a race, have some ranges, give yourself some grace because some miles are going to be slower or faster than others. So, but I think we do a pretty good job. I think it's really the value of the race sims.
Exactly. And keep in mind, too, going back to our conversation at the beginning of the podcast today, if it's really, really hot and humid, some of this goes out the window. And often it does turn into like, I need to finish this race safely. If it's one of those extreme days where it's extremely humid and extremely hot and you're going to be finishing the run in the middle of the day, then we're probably not going to use this exact guide. But this is a place to start if you're trying to forecast a little bit what you think you can do. And keep in mind that I often really trust my athletes. Like when we have conversations before the race, they'll ask me what pace I think they can run. I'll ask them what pace they think they can run, and we'll sort of work on that together. Usually they have a pretty good sense. Like you guys know your bodies, you know what you've been seeing in your training even better than your coach does. And so it is sort of more in a conversation. And I think often those estimates from athletes are a little bit conservative because it's scary to say like, well, on the best day, maybe I could do this. But that conservative estimate is often a really, really good place to be, barring any type of weird heat stuff. So trust your intuition a little bit and know that when you get that feeling of like, oh, wow, that felt really good, and I think I could do that on race day, that's a feeling that you should trust. And hopefully we're feeling that a little bit in some of our race sims.
Yep. One of your comments about, sort of like race day is out, safety, that kind of thing. I had something freaky happen to me. I don't know if I've told this in the podcast before, but I once did Ironman Kansas 70.3. And it was this obviously very pretty flat kind of rolling course. Anyway, but it turns out the X factor of that day was the swim. And it was this little kind of swamp area that they had to swim in. It's totally terrible. But I'm standing in transition. I'm looking down at the swim buoys out there, and they're moving all over the place. I'm like, that's kind of weird. And anyway, my wave gets in, and I realized halfway out through the swim, I realized that there's like 3-foot waves in this crazy little swamp in Kansas. And I remember people were hanging on to boats, and there was just complete chaos everywhere. And I'm just thinking like, wow, like this has not become a triathlon. This has become a survival situation. And I sort of just flipped it in my head like, oh, like this is crazy. Boats capsized and there's people everywhere and everybody was cutting the course. And I remember when I did the entire course, but I thought, I'll just do a bunch of breaststroke. Like, wow, look at these waves. This is incredible. Look at the chaos out here. And I was like, at that point, I realized like, in some ways it was easy because I was like, the whole day doesn't matter now because all I have to do is get back to the shore without drowning or grabbing onto a boat. And it was a very, very interesting switch, but you sort of expect that switch sometimes in the bike or even in the run, but definitely not in the swim.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just being prepared for uncontrollables, just like we
Hmm.
talked about. It's hard to replicate something like that. But if you're mixing in a little bit of chaos, I think we can find it. I think, Jim, with where we are right now, timing wise, we can really, really quickly hit an insight that you have just on bike fit, which I think is
Mm.
important. This is something that comes up a little bit. And then maybe we'll push our other insights to future episodes. Should we be making any changes to our bike fit leading up to the race? Maybe something feels a little off. How have you been thinking about that with your athletes?
Yeah, it's super tempting. You're sort of out there doing your big stuff, like, oh, that's not quite right. But I'm going to say right now, like, please do not make any small changes. When I say small changes, even like a millimeter or two is kind of they call it a millimeter is a mile in bike fitting. So if you start to mess around with your seat saddle, your angle or the up and down on it before a race sim or that, please don't do that. Try to address that issue again with a bike fitter before. And again, you're probably pretty close. And I recently went to a local bike fitter here. We have a new bike fitter in our area. And I was off by, like a millimeter on a couple of my bikes. And I could kind of feel it. And I was like, well, I'm just going. And this guy put him on. I was like, hey, you were pretty close. But then we got it back on millimeter. I was like, great. So, but anyway, if you're experiencing discomfort, please get it dealt with. Do not DIY. And please do not DIY it like before your big race sims or before your races. I've had a couple of athletes recently who have done that and has been not good outcomes, shall we say. And I say, how bad can this possibly be? I say, so basically, if you gave me a choice between staying up all night partying with your friends the night before a race or moving your bike seat the day before, I'd say I would take the party every single time.
That is a hot take, but a very, very powerful metaphor for sure. All right. Well, we've had a couple of internet issues today, and it keeps dropping around, and we're up on time. So I think we are going to move to challenge of the week and gear pick of the week. Jim, what is your challenge or resource of the week? We always allow both.
That's great. Well, I have two this week. Speaking of heat, there's this Run Writings, which is a website, which Adam, shout out to him who put me onto this. Run Writings, heat adjust pace calculator. You can put in there your pace that you want to run, and you can put on the heat and the humidity, and it will give you, for example, like an extreme or, sort of somewhat extreme heat. If you want to run a 7, that's equivalent to like a 645, for example. So anyway, this is the Jahi in chart form. It's kind of a cool thing to look at. So I would use that as a resource, as a guide anyway. And then my challenge of the week is just, we talked about this before, drink one more water bottle of electrolytes than you're doing now, generally before your exercise.
I love it. All right. I have a single challenge of the week. Mine is actually log the mileage of your run shoes and order new ones when you're getting close to 200. Strava makes it really easy to do that, where every time you get new shoes, you just pop them in there and then you can toggle which ones you're using on a given run. And sometimes I'll have athletes who are like, yeah, I haven't actually gotten shoes since last August. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no. Like, this is something that we can control when it comes to injury prevention. And also, we don't want to wait until our shoes are completely dead to get new ones. Like, ideally, we're breaking in a new pair as the other ones are sort of on their way out. So I would say do that. You can even give them a cool name. You can mention the model, all of that. I have like Hoka Rocket X3 Lemonade because they're sort of a yellow and pink color, which also brings me to my gear pick of the week. I have recommended the Hoka Rocket X2 multiple times. My new run shoe is the Hoka Rocket X3. It's just the newest speed shoe. And I always get a little skittish when they change their models around, but I really like these ones and I felt pretty zippy on the run, even though it's been hot and brutal. At least my shoes are not necessarily holding me back.
When you say 200 miles, do you mean like for a year? It's like what if my run total is like 100? I have I have shoes for 2 years. Is that what you're saying?
There you go. Perfect. I love it.
Thank you.
Jim, what's your gear pick of the week?
My gear pick of the week is the Element. They have a new flavor called, well, I don't know what it is, but lemonade salt, which is really, really good. And again, like back to Element, like so many different flavors, put them in there, just get a whole variety of stuff, but I'm really enjoying the lemonade.
I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you for bearing with our long conversation on the heat. I'm hoping that it won't be needed like every single episode and every single week and every single workout going forward, but it is a big deal. That is sort of a shared experience for at least everybody in New England right now and probably all over the United States. It is summer, so heat is here. If there are other topics that you want us to address, please consider filling out our feedback form, which is always linked in the show notes, and checking out our show notes where you can find more detailed information on everything we mentioned today. Or if there's other topics that you want to learn a little bit more about, just go to our search bar and you can put in something like heat. And probably we've had this episode like for the last 2 years at this time of year. You could listen to each yearly iteration of how we talk about heat or other topics, but you can do that with the search word terms. You could also drop us a rating or a review or follow the podcast or share it with someone who might want to listen. But anyway, thank you so much for listening and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, peeps.